Sanctions on India and Brazil because they work with the Russians sound nice, and we even like it very much. But this is politics. We need to understand that there is a certain subtext here. So let's try to understand what the truth is here. So some publications write, Trump's strike on Brazil is because of the Russians, but coffee is getting more expensive, meat plants are shutting down, and markets are shaking. So, U.S. President Donald Trump signed a decree that imposes a 50% duty on imports of goods from Brazil, a country that is one of the world's main suppliers of agricultural products. This decision has already begun to affect global markets. Orange juice fell sharply in price, while coffee prices soared. Although some goods were removed from the customs list, such as orange juice, many others remained at risk. Among them are Brazilian coffee and beef, which occupy a significant place in the country's exports. The markets immediately reacted, with orange juice prices in New York falling to the maximum permissible limit of 25 cents per pound. This represents a drop of almost 9%. At the same time, prices for Arabica coffee jumped by 3.5% to 3.3 per pound, and then fell slightly to $2.97. This price hike is due to the fact that coffee was not included in the list of exemptions, meaning that it will remain subject to high duties for the time being at least. Fernando Maximiliano, analyst at StoneX, explained, the market immediately reacted to the news that coffee did not receive an exemption. Consequently, the cost of coffee in the United States may increase. Although there is still a chance for a revision, for now it is a signal for price growth. The United States is a key buyer of Brazilian orange juice with 40% of exports and coffee with 16% of exports. As for beef, its main buyer is China, but exports to the United States have also been growing recently due to the decline in the American livestock population, which has reached its lowest level in 73 years. The news about Brazil does not end there, as the United States Senate is sounding the alarm. Democrats accuse Trump of using tariffs as political pressure on Brazil. Influential Democratic senators opposed Donald Trump's plans to impose high tariffs on imports from Brazil. They argue that these duties are not economic but political in nature, and are intended to influence the investigation against Trump's ally, former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. We are particularly concerned about these duties on Brazil. They are being imposed to force the Brazilian Supreme Court to stop the criminal prosecution of Trump's longtime friend Jair Bolsonaro, who is accused of inciting a violent coup, according to a joint statement by Democratic Senators Tim Kaine, Chuck Schumer, Jeanne Shaheen, and Ron Wyden. The 50% tariff is set to take effect next week, although some major exports from Brazil have been exempted. The very fact of introducing such a measure caused a loud resonance. The Democrats plan to use a special procedure to submit a so-called privileged resolution. This is one of the few ways that Congress can counteract the president's actions in the area of tariff policy.
Це не перша спроба демократів зупинити мита. Раніше цього року вони вже добилися ухвалення подібної ініціативи щодо скасування мит на імпорт з Канади.
Then it passed with the support of both parties in the Senate. But a similar resolution in the House of Representatives was blocked before the vote. If the new resolution is adopted, Trump may still veto it, as he threatened to do during the Canadian case. However, if the Congress unites and manages to collect 2 to 3 of the votes, it can override the presidential veto. Meanwhile, a Brazilian court has challenged Trump. We will not submit to foreign pressure, they say. Brazilian Supreme Court Judge Alexandre de Moraes stated he wouldn't halt proceedings against former President Jair Bolsonaro, despite sanctions from the Trump administration. This marks the Democrats' second attempt, after successfully passing a similar initiative earlier this year, to remove duties on Canadian imports. Moraes stressed that neither he nor the judiciary would allow foreign governments to interfere in justice. No country has been punished more demonstratively than Brazil, which hosted this year's BRICS summit. It was subject to a record 50% duty plus other punitive measures. Despite the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil. Another source of conflict is the role of the Brazilian Supreme Court in regulating social media. The court ordered the online platforms to remove content containing hate speech, anti-democratic calls, or violence. This drew the ire of Trump, who called it a tyrannical suppression of free speech. Although even the Financial Times itself admits that some of the court's decisions were harsh, they do not justify such aggressive statements. The situation with Brazil shows how far Trump is willing to go in abusing his presidential powers over tariffs. In other words, the court is not just defending its powers, it is also trying to protect democracy after the coup attempt. And Bolsonaro seems to be using all his connections again, even through his son in the United States, to avoid punishment. This conflict is political, not economic. Brazil is one of the few major economies in trade with which the United States has a surplus. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, last year the United States earned $6.8 billion from trade with Brazil, with a total trade turnover of $91.5 billion. Trump directly linked the 50% tariffs to the legal cases against former President Bolsonaro, his ideological ally who is accused of attempting a coup after losing the 2022 elections. "Leave Bolsonaro alone," Trump wrote on social media in early July.
"Залиште Болсонару в спокої", написав він в соцмережах на початку липня.
No country has been punished more demonstratively than Brazil, which hosted this year's BRICS summit. It was subject to a record 50% duty plus other punitive measures. Despite the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil. Another source of conflict is the role of the Brazilian Supreme Court in regulating social media. The court ordered the online platforms to remove content containing hate speech, anti-democratic calls, or violence. This drew the ire of Trump, who called it a tyrannical suppression of free speech. Although even the Financial Times itself admits that some of the court's decisions were harsh, they do not justify such aggressive statements. The situation with Brazil shows how far Trump is willing to go in abusing his presidential powers over tariffs. This is not just a trade conflict, it is a struggle for the right to decide which courts are legitimate, which elections are valid, and who has sovereignty in the 21st century. Trump's tariffs are not about coffee, they are about whether a country has the right to judge a friend of Trump's without risking economic punishment. If this practice is continued or supported by other global players, it will mark the beginning of a new era, an era of politically motivated sovereignty. The forecast may be as follows. Brazil will not give in, and the Supreme Court, under pressure from the United States, may speed up Bolsonaro's trial to demonstrate its independence. This will exacerbate the conflict. In response, Brazil may intensify cooperation with China or with the Russians, including through the BRICS, as they have also discussed, and increase trade in yuan or real, which would weaken the dollar's position in the region. Inside the U.S., the Congress or the courts may try to limit Trump's actions by citing the abuse of presidential authority and customs policy. But this is possible only if there is political will and a break in the Republican Party itself. The U.S. business community also has a voice, especially importers of coffee, juice, and meat, and they will start putting pressure on the government because they are already seeing rising prices, reduced supplies, and losses on the stock exchanges. As for Europe, it can also use this moment to deepen economic ties with Brazil amid the cooling of relations with Washington. So we see that basically Trump is just doing what he needs to do, but wrapping it all up in a beautiful, chic, delicious wrapper that says, I'm fighting Putin to end the war.
Смачну обгортку, де написано «Я борюся з Путіним, щоб припинити війну».
But in fact, the struggle, for example, with Brazil, 50% of the duty, is very high. But the person imposes these duties not to stop the war, but to push his own interests, but he wraps it up very nicely. And here we have a lot of questions. If Trump really wants to end the war, are these real actions? Is this enough? And what actions can be considered real, and will they actually be implemented?
І які ж тоді дії можна вважати реальними, і взагалі-то чи будуть вони впроваджені?